to part 1 of my Python programming fast track course. If you haven't watched my intro video, please do that first. I'll link it at the top and at the bottom. So part 1 is all about the basics, and I don't overwhelm you with all of the basics, just a few that we can use to build our first Python program, and we'll do that at the end. Now, I do have a link in the description of the coding notebook that I will be using in part 1. So you can pause here, click that link, and use that notebook so you can code right along with me, where I have some helpful tips and sort of like a cheat sheet to help you along this fast track. So if you've done that and you have CoLab or whatever coding environment you choose already set up and ready to go, then let's dive in. So let's go into our part 1 basic Python notebook. And if you're following along with me on CoLab, you'll notice that my notebook is in dark mode. So if you'd like to change your notebook to match mine, you can simply go to Tools, Settings, and change your theme here at the top. So the first thing I'd like to show you are comments. And CoLab displays comments in green like this one. Comments are not code. Rather, they are notes for you or whoever is reading your code. Often, you'll want to add notes about what some specific pieces of code are doing for later reference. To create a comment, you simply put a hash in front of whatever line you want to turn into a comment. So, no hash is not a comment, a hash is a comment. Now let's scroll to print. We'll be using print to display outputs of code. We can also use it for debugging, but we'll cover that in a later lesson. So to print, we'll write the print function and open parentheses. Now notice CoLab will auto-complete the parentheses for you, so that is pretty handy. And say we want to print the number 3. We simply type in the number we'd like to print and press Shift and Enter to run the code in that cell. And as you can see, Python printed our number 3. To change your code, you can simply click in the cell where you'd like to change, which print 100, rerun the cell, and Python has printed our new code. Easy peasy, and technically you've written your first Python program. However, at the end of part 1, we are going to code a program that's a bit more worthy of being called a program. We'll do that later, just stick with me. Now let's talk about numbers and numerical values in particular. I have 2 of the numerical values here, integers and floats. So integers are whole numbers, and I'll just insert a cell here. A whole number is 1, a whole number is 100, 333, -8. These are all whole numbers. Now floats are not whole numbers. We insert another code cell here. So 3.14 is a float. There is a stored decimal value with any float. And that also means that even a 1.0 or 000 is a float. Even though this is a whole number, Python stores the decimal values. And whenever it does that, that number is considered a float. And sometimes mixing integers and float can interfere in your calculations in Python. So again, it's important to distinguish the difference between floats and integers. We can change the value of a float to an integer by using the int function. So if we want to change the value of 3.99 to an integer, we can simply wrap it in the int function and Shift Enter to run the cell. And as you can see, Python has dropped the stored decimal value and we just have a 3. Now Python also allows us to change integers into floats. So if we were to float our 3 and run that cell, you can see our output is a 3.0. So just to reiterate, when we change the value of a float to an integer, Python loses the decimal value. So as Python programmers, we need to be careful about changing numerical values so we don't lose important data unintentionally. Alright, next is text, and in programming we call text strings. And to create a string of text, you simply wrap your text in quotations. You can use double quotes or single quotes. Python doesn't care. And here we can use the print function again to create a string of whatever we like. Now we just run the cell by pressing Shift-Enter, and Python has printed our string. We can print multiple strings within the same print function by adding a comma and printing something else. Press Shift-Enter to execute the cell again, and Python has printed both of our strings. Now remember, we can print numbers using the print function. Another distinction you must make as a programmer is strings are not numbers, and strings cannot be calculated. So for example, in our last cell here, we've printed the number 3. If we were to also print the string of 3, so this is a text 3, and we can run those together, our outputs look exactly the same. This can be a little tricky when coding, so it's important to know whether you're dealing with numbers or strings. And to illustrate this, we can calculate some numbers here. Now, we haven't got to the math and calculations part yet, but this is pretty intuitive, 3 plus 3. And these 3's are numbers. However, in this line of code, we'll print the string 3 plus 3. When we run those together, you can see numbers calculate, text does not. And Python treats numbers and strings differently, hence the different outputs. Alright, now that we've got strings and numbers down, let's scroll to math and calculations. And these should be pretty intuitive. We use a plus for add, a hyphen for subtract, an asterisk for multiply, and a / for divide. So we can do some examples here just to illustrate. 30 plus 10, we can run that. We can change this to minus 10. And then when we get to divide, just a note that Python will always calculate a float when we divide. So 30 divided by 10 outputs a float of 3. This is just something that is baked into Python. If you ever wanted to change the output into an integer and drop the 0.0, of course we can wrap it in an int function and rerun. Let's scroll to variables now. And this is where coding gets fun. Variables are nicknames for values or pieces of code that we can reuse without having to rewrite that piece of code. So for example, if we have the value of 1,000, let's say that's our income. We can name it income simply by writing income and an equal sign. We can create another variable, bills, and make it 300. Now when we run this cell, you can see there's no output. And that is simply because Python has just stored our nicknames for our variables. So there is nothing for Python to calculate and provide an output. So let's give Python something to calculate with these variables. Suppose we want to calculate our net income, which would be our income minus the bills. So that is exactly what we'll tell Python by writing income minus bills and run that cell. And as you can see, Python has calculated that for us. We can even go one step farther and name this calculation net income. We'll run that cell. We have just told Python to store the nickname of net income. But when we call net income, Python has again calculated that for us. Now, Python is a little picky when it comes to naming variables. And Python only accepts variables that are written in certain ways. The first letter of a variable must be lowercases, and Python does not accept any spaces in the variable name. Also, as programmers, we want to make sure we are using easy, intuitive names that let us know what these variables are. Using variable names like X or Y, like we did in math class, doesn't really reflect exactly what our variables are. So we want to give them intuitive names that follow Python's variable name rules. All right, now we are ready to code our first program. And you can follow along with me and create your own afterwards. Remember, using code and writing programs is the best way to learn how to code. So let's write a very simple Python program that executes math calculations on variables, and then we'll print an output of a string that displays the calculated results. And don't be intimidated by this mathematical, programmatic language. You already know this. We are just putting it all together. And for my example, I'm going to calculate the average number of people hired at my company this month. So we'll write that in a comment, starting with a hash, and this program So just for simplicity of my example here, let's assume that I already know the number of people hired at my company each week. And we can label these as variables. I'll label them week 1, week 2, week 3, and week 4. And again, these numbers are arbitrary. Now, what would we want our program to do with these numbers? We want to calculate the average. So to calculate the average, we need to add these variables and then divide by the total weeks, which would be 4. And I'll wrap those in a parentheses. So week 1 plus week 2 plus week 3. Oops. Plus week 4. And then grouping all of those together, we want to divide by 4. So Shift Enter to run, and Python has calculated the average for us. I can also name our calculation to make it easy to recall it without having to write this code again. And I'll just name it average hires. And now if we run this cell, again, we have no output because we've simply told Python to remember the name average hires. But we can ask Python to calculate average hires by calling it. But for our program, just outputting a number may not be really helpful to a user of this program if they don't know what this number means. So let's add some text to explain what our output is. I'll remove our average hires since we know it works. And now let's print some text. And we're going to say the average hires at our company this month is, and instead of typing in the actual number, we want Python to auto-populate this for us. And if you remember, we can print more than one thing inside one print function. So we'll go outside of our string quotes here, add a comma, and we want to print the average hires. So we can run this, and Python has printed our string and calculated the average hires for us. And if you'd like to be grammatically correct, we can add a period here and rerun that. Now, one other thing about our calculation. Our string output says that we've hired 7.25 people this month, which is kind of strange to say because you can't hire a quarter of a person. So we can drop this 0.25 from our average number by using the int function. I don't want to add the int function here in case we were to use this average hires calculation in another calculation later on in the program. Doing so would lose the value of the 0.25 and would alter the math calculations when used somewhere else. So I simply just want to display the whole number of people that we've hired. And we can do that here in the print function by wrapping average hires in an int and rerunning that. So now we have the average number of hires at our company. This month is 7 whole people that we've hired. And that, my friends, is a very simple Python program using some of the basics of Python programming. And that's it! You have coded your first Python program. I knew you could do it. Each program we build will be progressively more robust, and you can use all of these in your own coding portfolio, and of course you can edit them any way you choose. And I'll see you in part 2.